He carried more than letters in his worn leather bag. He carried secrets that could destroy entire families. In the winter of 1944, postal worker Thomas Brennan walked the same routes through Brooklyn that he'd walked for 15 years. The same brownstones, the same stoops. But everything had changed. The war had reached into every home, pulling sons and fathers across an ocean to die on foreign soil. And Thomas Brennan had become something else entirely, a protector of the desperate. The first time it happened, he wasn't prepared. Mrs. Sullivan grabbed his arm as he handed her the mail, her fingers trembling. Her son Jimmy was hiding in the basement. He'd come home 3 weeks earlier, walked off a transport ship and disappeared into the night. The boy couldn't take it anymore. The nightmares, the shaking. He was 19 years old and already broken by what he'd seen in Italy. Thomas could have reported it, should have reported it. Desertion carried the death penalty, but he looked into Mrs. Sullivan's eyes and saw his own mother, who'd lost 2 sons in the First War. He nodded, slipped the official mail into his bag, and walked away. That night, he burned the draft board's inquiry about Private James Sullivan. Word spread the way secrets do in tight neighborhoods. Whispers in breadlines, knowing looks across church pews. Soon other mothers approached him. They knew somehow that Thomas Brennan, the quiet mailman with the slight limp from childhood polio, would help them protect their boys who'd come home broken. He developed a system. Official letters looking for deserters went into a special pocket. At night, he'd steam them open, memorize the names, and warn the families. He learned to forge responses, to misdirect, to buy time. He became an expert in the bureaucracy of war, using its own weight against it. By spring 1945, Thomas had hidden evidence of 37 deserters, 37 young men who might have faced firing squads. He kept a small notebook with their names, hidden behind a loose brick in his apartment wall. Not their real names, but the names their mothers called them: Jimmy, Tony, Little Pete. The weight of those undelivered letters never left him. Even decades later, he'd sometimes wake at night, feeling the phantom weight of that leather bag, heavy with secrets that saved lives. The first boy he saved tried to kill himself twice before Thomas found him. Anthony Rossi had made it through North Africa, Sicily, and halfway up Italy before his mind shattered. The breaking point came watching his best friend step on a mine meant for him. Anthony walked away from his unit that night and didn't stop walking until he found himself back in Brooklyn, hiding in his family's coal cellar. Thomas discovered him by accident. Mrs. Rossi led him to the cellar where Anthony sat in the corner, 22 years old and 40 pounds lighter than when he'd enlisted. His eyes were empty. His hands shook constantly. That night, Thomas made a decision that would define the rest of his war. He went to the Western Union office and sent a telegram. Private Anthony Rossi had been killed in action, heroically saving 3 members of his squad. It was the first of many deaths Thomas would fabricate. The forgeries became elaborate. Thomas spent evenings studying military documents, learning the language of casualty reports. He practiced signatures until his hand cramped, becoming a dozen different officers, filing reports that would bury these boys in paperwork while they learned to live again. The network grew. Mrs. Chen from the laundry would wash uniforms. Father Murphy provided sanctuary in the church basement. Dr. Goldstein treated wounds and minds broken by war, never asking questions. The butcher, the baker, the corner grocer, they all became part of an invisible army protecting those who couldn't fight anymore. Not all of them made it. Tommy Chen hanged himself before Thomas could reach him. Michael O'Brien was caught by MPs and executed for desertion 6 weeks later. Their names went into Thomas's notebook too, marked with small crosses. But for everyone lost, 3 were saved, hidden in attics and basements, slowly piecing themselves back together. Anthony Rossi became a baker, his hands finally steady enough to knead dough. Others found peace in gardens and workshops, in the quiet rhythms of civilian life. Years later, Thomas would receive unsigned Christmas cards, wedding invitations with no return address, photographs of children who existed because their fathers had been given a second chance. He kept them all in a box beneath his bed. Proof that sometimes the greatest act of patriotism is protecting people from their own country's cruelty. The letters from the front told Thomas everything about why boys were breaking. He'd steam them open late at night to understand. Dear Mom, I can't stop seeing Jimmy's face. It wasn't there anymore. Another. Pop, I shot a kid yesterday. He was crying for his mother. In German, but I knew what he was saying. One letter changed everything. Corporal David Weinstein wrote to his sister about lying beneath his dead squad for 6 hours during an ambush, about surviving by playing dead while Germans walked past. The guilt was eating him alive. He wanted to die. Thomas delivered that letter on Tuesday. By Friday, David had arrived home AWOL, convinced he needed to turn himself in and accept death as punishment for his cowardice. That night, Thomas told David about his own father, who'd survived World War I by hiding under corpses during a gas attack, how his father drank himself to death by the time Thomas was 12, unable to live with surviving. Thomas told David that dying wouldn't honor his friends, living would. The official notices kept coming, threats of court-martial, of firing squads. Thomas burned them all. He became an expert at creating bureaucratic confusion that could hide a deserter for months. He filed false sighting reports, sending military police to chase ghosts. Some families couldn't handle the strain. The Kowalski brothers turned their eldest son in. 2 months later, Private Stefan Kowalski was executed by firing squad. His crime, breaking after watching his unit burn alive in a tank. The successes were quieter. James Murphy became a teacher. Vincent Bianchi found peace as a librarian. Samuel Goldman spent his hidden years learning to be a doctor, determined to save lives after taking so many. By 1946, his network had saved over 100 deserters, 100 families kept whole. Thomas knew that in official history, he'd be considered a traitor. But when he walked his route and saw these men rebuilding their lives, he knew he'd fought his own war, and won. The girl at the Western Union office knew exactly what Thomas was doing, and she helped him do it better. Margaret O'Connell was 23, with sharp green eyes and fingers that could type 90 words a minute. The first time their eyes met over a falsified casualty report, he expected her to call the authorities. Instead, she quietly corrected his formatting. Her brother had come home from the Pacific missing his left leg and most of his sanity. She understood why Thomas did what he did. Heroes shouldn't be hunted for having limits. Together, they refined the system. Margaret would intercept military communications, alerting Thomas to impending searches. She taught him routing codes, the small details that made lies believable. She had access to real casualty lists, and she'd match deserters to actual battles. Private Joseph Battaglia, hiding in his cousin's bakery, became one of the unnamed dead at Monte Cassino. Margaret's position gave her access to military police movements. She developed a code hidden in routine telegrams. Storm approaching from the west meant raids in Irish neighborhoods. Thomas would decode these and spread warnings through his network. One night she showed him a telegram that made his blood freeze. The army was implementing a new system to catch forgeries. They worked until dawn, creating a paper trail so complex it would take months to unravel. They built a bureaucratic maze that would protect their boys through confusion alone. The close calls were terrifying. Once an FBI agent arrived just as Margaret was destroying evidence. She smiled, flirted, pretended to be impressed while feeding papers into the furnace behind her back. By war's end, they'd created an archive of death, hundreds of forged reports, thousands of misdirected communications. Margaret kept copies of everything, hidden in telegraph equipment she'd reported as destroyed. After VJ Day, she became a teacher. Years later, when she was dying, she asked Thomas to burn her archives. Instead, he kept them, proof that in the machinery of war, human kindness could still find a way to save lives. The first time Thomas lost a boy he was trying to save, it nearly broke him. Patrick Donnelly was 19, with freckles and a smile that had charmed half of Brooklyn. He'd survived D-Day, fought through Normandy, helped liberate Paris. But somewhere in Belgium, something snapped. His unit found him talking to his dead squad leader, killed 3 weeks earlier. Patrick deserted outside Antwerp, appearing on his mother's doorstep convinced Germans were closing in. Thomas did everything right. Perfect paper trail, safe house, even a psychiatrist. But Patrick's mind was too far gone. On January 15, 1945, Patrick, dressed in his uniform, pinned on his medals and jumped from their 6-story building. He left a note. "I'm too tired to be brave anymore." Thomas found his body on his morning route. That night, Thomas almost quit. Margaret found him at dawn, surrounded by torn-up forgeries. She convinced him to visit Anthony Rossi, now teaching his nephew in the family bakery. His hands were steady. He was wounded but alive. That's when Thomas understood he couldn't save them all. But saving some was better than none. They lost others. Samuel Torres hanged himself. Michael Szymanski drowned in the East River. Each death was shrapnel in Thomas's chest. But for each one lost, they saved a dozen more. The successes were quieter. Boys who'd arrived as ghosts slowly became human again. They found jobs, fell in love, started families. Thomas kept photographs, weddings where the groom had once wanted to die, baptisms of babies whose fathers had been saved from firing squads. He never forgot Patrick Donnelly. By war's end, they'd lost perhaps 20 boys they'd tried to save, but they'd saved over 200. The arithmetic of mercy always favored life. The knock at 3 a.m. wasn't unusual, but the man standing outside was. Colonel James Harrison had commanded the 82nd Airborne through Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. His chest bore enough medals to stock a museum. And his own son was AWOL, hiding somewhere in Brooklyn, broken by the same war his father was winning. Thomas could have been arrested on the spot, but looking into the colonel's eyes, he saw only a father's desperation. He led him through darkened streets to where Tommy Harrison was hidden. The boy didn't recognize his father, kept talking to someone named Richards. The colonel later explained Richards had died in Tommy's arms at Bastogne. The colonel knelt beside his broken son and wept. Then he turned to Thomas. "I've been sending boys to die for 3 years. I never thought about the ones who died but kept breathing." The colonel became an unlikely ally. He couldn't openly help, but he could misdirect investigations, delay searches, provide intelligence. He told Thomas about entire units with desertion rates above 50%. Boys found catatonic in foxholes. Men who'd turned weapons on themselves rather than face another day. Through the colonel, they orchestrated a mass bureaucratic disappearance. 43 soldiers with severe battle fatigue scheduled to return to combat simultaneously developed paperwork problems. By the time anyone untangled the mess, the war was over. Tommy Harrison slowly recovered. The dead stopped visiting. He learned to sleep without screaming. After the war, the colonel pushed for better treatment of combat fatigue, for recognition that mental wounds were as real as physical ones. The last time Thomas saw him, the colonel was walking with his recovered son in Prospect Park. Tommy was married, working as an accountant, still fragile but functional. They'd been unlikely allies in an underground war, saving boys from a system that would have destroyed them. The children always knew something was wrong. Little Maria Benedetti was 6 when she asked Thomas why her daddy lived in the attic. Her father had walked away after being ordered to execute Italian partisans who looked like his cousins. She called him the attic ghost who kept them safe from bad dreams. Thomas realized he wasn't just hiding soldiers. He was protecting entire families living with dangerous secrets. Children who couldn't invite friends home. Wives who had to lie to neighbors. Families in constant fear of a knock that would tear them apart. Some families thrived despite the pressure. The Kowalski children became expert secret keepers, creating warning systems to protect their father. But others cracked. Thomas watched marriages dissolve, children grow silent and withdrawn, carrying secrets too heavy for small shoulders. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson's husband George had been a combat medic who'd broken after running out of morphine, having to listen to dying boys scream. He'd sit in their closet organizing imaginary medical supplies. Their 3 children were terrified of him. The network expanded again. They found safe houses where broken soldiers could stay when their presence at home became too dangerous. Margaret organized support groups for wives hidden as church sewing circles. Dr. Goldstein started sessions for children. The children often became unexpected healers. Little Tommy Rossi brought his father morning coffee in the basement, sitting quietly while Anthony returned to the present. The Weinstein girls would read to their father during flashbacks, their voices anchoring him. These families paid a price for mercy. They lived outside normal society, isolated by secrets. But Thomas also saw incredible resilience. Families that grew stronger through struggle. Love that endured despite the darkness. By 1946, Thomas was protecting not just 200 deserters, but over 500 family members living in the shadows. An invisible community bound by shared secrets. Proof that human bonds could survive even the machinery of war. The end of the war didn't end the hiding. VE Day came with celebration in the streets, but in the basements and attics of Brooklyn, broken soldiers remained frozen in place. The guns had stopped firing across the ocean, but in their minds, the war raged on. Some didn't even know it was over. Thomas found Joseph Martinez still hiding in a church crypt 3 weeks after Germany surrendered. The boy had been there for 7 months, convinced MPs were waiting outside. When Thomas told him the war was over, Joseph just stared. "Not in here," he said, tapping his temple. "In here, it's still happening." The challenge now was different. How do you emerge from hiding when you're officially dead? How do you rejoin a world that's celebrating when you still wake up screaming? The network had saved these boys from execution, but now they had to save them from perpetual exile. Thomas and Margaret worked through the summer of 1945, creating new identities for those too broken to reclaim their old ones. They forged discharge papers, medical records, entire military histories that could withstand scrutiny. Some boys became their own cousins, taking the names of relatives who died as infants. Others simply vanished into America's vastness, starting over in cities where no one knew their faces. The hardest part was convincing them it was safe. Many had been hiding so long that fear had become their natural state. Thomas would sit with them for hours, showing them newspapers, playing radio broadcasts, trying to prove the world had changed. But trauma doesn't end with treaties. For these boys, every knock on the door was still MPs coming to drag them away. Dr. Goldstein organized what he called emergence therapy. Gradual exposure to the outside world. First standing by windows, then opening doors, walking to the corner. Each step a small victory against the prison of their own fear. Some took months to walk a full block in daylight, but slowly they emerged. Anthony Rossi was one of the first to reclaim his life publicly. He opened his bakery with a grand celebration, his hands steady as he handed out fresh bread. When neighbors asked where he'd been, he simply said, "Getting well." It became the standard answer for all of them. "Where were you?" "Getting well." As if they'd been in some distant hospital instead of hiding in basements 3 blocks away. Not everyone could return to their old lives. Too many questions, too much risk. The network helped them relocate to California, Texas, Oregon. Places where they could start fresh without the weight of their past. Thomas kept in touch when he could, receiving letters from new addresses, updates on new lives built on foundations of forged documents. The official amnesty programs that came later helped some, but most remained wary. Trust once broken was hard to rebuild. They'd learned that their country could demand more than they could give, then punish them for having limits. That lesson didn't fade with peace treaties. By 1947, most of Thomas's boys had found their way back into some version of normal life. They worked in shops and factories, married girls who either knew their secrets or accepted their silence. They raised children who would never fully understand why their fathers jumped at car backfires or couldn't watch war movies. The network formally dissolved that year, though the bonds remained. Margaret married a veteran who'd kept his sanity but understood those who hadn't. Dr. Goldstein continued treating trauma, now openly as the world slowly acknowledged that combat could break minds as surely as bodies. The colonel retired quietly, his son Tommy working in accounting. The ghosts finally silent. Thomas returned to being just a mailman. But he kept his notebook, kept the photographs, kept the evidence of what they'd done. Sometimes walking his route, he'd see one of his boys. A nod, a quiet, "Hello," nothing more. But in their eyes, he'd see gratitude too deep for words. He'd save them from their country's justice so they could save themselves from war's madness. The last entry in his notebook was dated December 1950, a Christmas card from Anthony Rossi, now with 3 children and a thriving bakery. Inside, a simple message: still getting well, still grateful. Thomas tucked it with all the others, proof that sometimes the greatest victory in war is refusing to let it destroy everything it touches. Decades passed, and the secret history of Thomas Brennan's network remained buried in Brooklyn basements and forgotten files. By 1970, Thomas was 75 years old, still walking a postal route, though shorter now. His hands shook slightly as he sorted mail, but his memory remained sharp enough to recognize names in the newspaper that made his blood run cold. The FBI was investigating draft dodgers from the new war in Vietnam, and somehow, they'd uncovered traces of what had happened during World War II. The first visit came on a Tuesday. 2 federal agents young enough to be his grandsons asking about irregularities in postal service during 1944-1945. Thomas played the confused old man, offering them tea, mishearing their questions. Yes, the mail had been difficult during the war. So many boys overseas, so many sad letters to deliver. But they kept coming back. Someone had found discrepancies in military records. Soldiers reported dead who'd been seen alive. Casualty reports that didn't match field records. A pattern of postal anomalies centered in Brooklyn. They were building a case, 25 years too late. Thomas burned his notebook that night, fed it page by page into his apartment's incinerator, watching names turn to ash. Jimmy Sullivan, Anthony Rossi, David Weinstein, Patrick Donnelly, 200 boys whose second chances disappeared in smoke. But he kept the photographs. Those he couldn't burn. Word spread through the old network. Margaret, now a grandmother, came to his apartment. Dr. Goldstein, retired but still sharp, offered legal advice. Even the colonel, nearly 80, made a rare trip from his estate. They discussed options, destroying evidence, creating alibis, fleeing. But they were all too old to run, too tired to hide. It was Anthony Rossi who offered the solution. Now a successful businessman with a chain of bakeries, he had resources. More importantly, he had courage. At a packed press conference, he announced the truth. He'd deserted from the army in 1944. He'd been hidden by a network of Brooklyn citizens, and he wasn't ashamed. Within days, others came forward. David Weinstein, now a respected psychiatrist. James Murphy, who'd become a beloved teacher. One by one, the hidden boys of Brooklyn revealed themselves. They told their stories, the breaking, the hiding, the healing. The second chances that had let them become productive citizens instead of executed deserters. The public response surprised everyone. This was 1970, and America was watching a new generation of boys break in Vietnam. The country had learned hard lessons about the cost of war on young minds. What had been treason in 1945 looked like mercy through the lens of 1970. The investigation stalled. Prosecutors faced the prospect of putting an elderly mailman on trial for saving traumatized veterans, of sending grandmothers to prison for hiding boys who'd given all they could give. Public opinion had shifted. Editorial writers asked whether following orders was always more important than basic humanity. Thomas testified before a closed Senate committee in 1971. He told them everything. The forgeries, the network, the lives saved and lost. He showed them the photographs, weddings, graduations, grandchildren who existed because their grandfathers had been given time to heal. When asked if he regretted his actions, he simply said, "I regret the ones I couldn't save." No charges were ever filed. The statute of limitations had expired on most potential crimes. More importantly, no prosecutor wanted to be the one to jail heroes of mercy. The committee sealed their findings for 50 years, officially closing the matter. But unofficially, something important had happened. The story of Brooklyn's hidden soldiers entered the public consciousness. It became part of the conversation about how America treats its veterans, about the difference between cowardice and trauma, about the courage it takes to choose healing over honor. Thomas lived another 6 years. At his funeral in 1977, the church overflowed. Hundreds came to pay respects. Veterans from 3 wars, families whose fathers and grandfathers he'd saved. Margaret gave the eulogy, finally free to tell the whole truth about the quiet mailman who'd carried more than letters. They buried him with military honors, though he'd never served. The flag on his coffin was presented to Anthony Rossi, who accepted it on behalf of all the boys Thomas had saved. As they lowered the casket, someone started singing Amazing Grace. 200 voices joined in. Men who'd been lost but now were found, who'd been blind but now could see. The true memorial came later, a small plaque in Prospect Park, paid for by the families of the saved. It reads simply, "To those who understood that mercy is the highest form of duty." Thomas Brennan, 1895-1977. He delivered more than mail. Today, in a small Brooklyn apartment, Anthony Rossi's great-granddaughter discovers a box in the attic. Inside are old photographs, men in uniform, but something's different about them. They look broken, haunted, lost. There are letters, too, written in shaky hands. Stories of hiding, of fear, of a mailman who saved lives by refusing to deliver death sentences. She brings the box to her great-grandfather, now 97, one of the last survivors of Thomas Brennan's network. His hands tremble as he holds the photographs. He sees faces he hasn't seen in decades. Boys who made it, boys who didn't, all of them brothers in a different kind of war. "Tell me," she says, and finally, after all these years, he does. He tells her about the basement, about learning to stop shaking, about Thomas Brennan, who looked like any other mailman but carried the weight of hundreds of lives in his leather bag, about Margaret at the telegraph office creating bureaucratic miracles, about Dr. Goldstein, who healed minds the army would have abandoned. He tells her about the network, ordinary people who chose mercy over law, who understood that sometimes the bravest thing isn't following orders but recognizing when someone has given all they can give, who created an underground railroad for broken soldiers, saving them from a system that would have destroyed them. Most importantly, he tells her about the healing, how broken boys became bakers and teachers and doctors, how they raised families, built businesses, contributed to the very society that would have executed them, how they proved that trauma doesn't have to be terminal, that breaking doesn't mean broken forever. Were they cowards? She asks. This young woman who's never known war. Anthony thinks of all the ways to answer. He could talk about different kinds of courage, about the complexity of trauma, about the difference between can't and won't. Instead, he tells her about Patrick Donnelly, who won medals for bravery before his mind shattered, about boys who fought until they had nothing left, then fought the daily battle of learning to live again. They were human, he says finally. And Thomas Brennan believed that was enough. The story spreads, as stories do in the digital age. Anthony's great-granddaughter posts about it online. Other descendants share their own family secrets. The hidden history of Brooklyn's deserters becomes visible, a reminder that in every war, there are those who break and those who help them heal. Veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan reach out, seeing their own struggles reflected in these old photographs. The conversation continues about what we owe those who serve, about the difference between honoring service and destroying the server, about how a nation treats its most wounded warriors. In 2025, the sealed Senate records will be released. The full story of Thomas Brennan's network will become official history. But for those who lived it, who were saved by it, the truth was never hidden. It lived in every wedding dance, every grandchild's laugh, every quiet morning where death wasn't chosen. They were the lucky ones. Not because they escaped war, but because when war broke them, someone caught them as they fell. A mailman, a telegraph operator, a neighborhood that chose mercy. They were given what every broken soldier deserves: time to heal, space to rebuild, the chance to discover that survival itself is a form of courage. Thomas Brennan never saw himself as a hero. He was just a mailman who understood that some letters should never be delivered, that sometimes the most patriotic thing is to protect people from their country's cruelty, that in a world of orders and obligations, individual conscience still matters. His legacy lives in every veteran who gets help instead of judgment, in every family that stays together through trauma, in every recognition that mental wounds are as real as physical ones. He delivered more than mail. He delivered hope to those who'd lost it, life to those who'd given up on it, future to those who couldn't see past their past. The war ended 80 years ago. But Thomas Brennan's war, the war for mercy, for understanding, for the radical idea that broken soldiers deserve healing instead of punishment, that war continues. And in Brooklyn basements and VA hospitals and therapist offices across the country, it's still being won, one saved life at a time. Like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. This channel is for those who believe history is made not only by armies, but by individual courage.